Okay, so thanks everybody for coming to our presentation, Fueling for Ultras with Shannon O'Grady. We Gnar Runners are excited to have a new partnership this year with Gnarly Nutrition. We're going to have Gnarly Nutrition at all of our trail races this year, so they'll be out on course for Quad Rock May 11th in just under 5 weeks, and then of course out on the Never Summer course, and then all of our shorter trail races as well. So we're going to have Gnarly Nutrition's Fuel 2.0 out there. That's a liquid hydration source, and I'll nutrition and hydration source, and I'll let Shannon talk a little bit about what you can expect to see in Fuel 2.0 when you're out on course at Quad Rock, Never Summer, and our other races. So Shannon is the Chief Executive Officer now of Gnarly, is that right?
Yeah, it's scary, but yes.
Okay, and also the Chief Product Officer, right?
Well, now I'm just I'm going with one
Just
title
CEO.
now. Yeah.
Okay. But more importantly, a PhD in nutrition physiology. So kind of an in-depth understanding of the science behind fueling for races and active pursuits. You know, it's obviously a bit of a mystery for a lot of us out on the course during the course of a long race. You know, it can be one of the hardest things to get right. And I feel like we're always experimenting in terms of what we're doing, trying to get that secret sauce for fueling. So Shannon's going to talk a little bit today about not only daily nutrition strategies for runners, but also that in-race fueling strategy, in addition to post-race fueling strategy, with some post-run recommendations for hydration, as well as carb and protein intake. Just a couple of housekeeping pieces. We will have time after Shannon's presentation. She's going to go about 30 to 35 minutes for questions. So if you have questions for Shannon, feel free to pop those into the chat, and then I'll moderate those after Shannon's done with her presentation. And I think we'll try and go about an hour, so we'll wrap this up right around 7, maybe just a little bit after 7. So Shannon, I think I will hand it over to you, and fill us in and enlighten us on the mysteries of getting that fueling strategy right during the course of long ultramarathon races.
I'll do my best. I mean, in reality, it just all comes down to practice. So got to find what works for you. Let me see if I can share my screen. And okay. So hopefully everybody can see that. This is my favorite running quote of all time, because I think, as Nick described, like, it really stresses the importance of nutrition in really capitalizing on all of the hard training you do, right? Nutrition is just one small piece of the equation, but it can quickly be the thing that ends your race. It can also be the thing that helps you, you know, have the race of your life. So I feel like this kind of encompasses it really well. I've had really talented runner friends tell me that they feel like ultras are, you know, just catered hikes, but I like the idea of thinking of it as a contest. So whoops, went too far. Hold on. Today, I want to talk a little bit about not just in training nutrition or in racing nutrition, but also daily intake, because so much of what we take in daily also provides us the energy and hydration that's required to perform, you know, week after week, and to build upon our training in order to accomplish our race goals. So specifically, I'm going to talk in depth about hydration, a little bit about the importance of carbohydrate, and then the importance of protein. And then specifically go into some post-training guidelines, once again, coming to hydration, carbohydrates, and protein. So let's start with hydration. I think it's really important to understand the importance of hydration. Often when athletes think of hydration, they are specifically thinking of what they need to take in while they're running. But daily hydration is key to starting hydrated, which can really help us maximize performance. It can reduce the risk of injury, and just overall help you feel better and recover better, especially as we're doing, back-to-back longer and harder weeks. So specifically, hydration benefits include waste removal, urination, perspiration, bowel movements, thermoregulation, joint lubrication, which can lead to injury reduction, and tissue protection. It's also important to note that when we think of hydration, water is really better absorbed when taken with sodium and glucose. And so if you're consuming water with a meal, that's great. You've got all your bases covered. But if you're just drinking water on its own throughout the day, you're actually better served by putting something in your water that contains a little bit of sodium and a little bit of glucose. Even adding maple syrup or a little bit of table salt to your water can accomplish this. But once again, we both passively transport water into our bodies and actively transport. So that active transport requires sodium and glucose to get that water absorbed. And so we're going to be better hydrated if we have some sodium and glucose present when we're drinking. Oops. Okay, so let's talk about how we figure out how much water we need on a daily basis. I'm sure you've all heard the 8 glasses a day rule, and that's really not based on much. And this is the kind of going model that I think is the best way to determine what hydration you need in order to make sure your daily water intake is appropriate given your sweat rate and how much you're exercising. And it's really a retrospective model. So you're capturing information on what you did the previous day. And it's called the WHAT model. And WHAT stands for weight, urine color, and thirst. And it's really easy to do. I'm sure many of you keep training diaries. And this could be information that you would include in your training diary. So you would do it first thing in the morning. The W stands for weight. Take a measurement of your weight every morning. If your morning body mass is within 1% of what your regular mass is, so it's not fluctuating hugely, that gives you a check mark that you are not dehydrated. Urine color, which many of us have heard related to our hydration status, is the second measurement. So darker the urine, the more dehydrated you are. Another term for dehydration is hypohydration. What's important to note about this is urine color really is a good measure of hydration status, but it's only a good measure of hydration status first thing in the morning. So a minute ago, I talked about consuming lots of water and the importance of having sodium and glucose in the water, or consuming your water with a meal, so you make sure you really absorb most of it. Well, if you drank tons and tons of water on its own, your urine could be a lighter color, but you're not actually absorbing any of the water. You're essentially just urinating it out. So that would be an example of where urine color would not be a good indicator of your hydration status. So first thing in the morning, when you really haven't had water during the evening, is really where urine color kind of gained its reliability in terms of a measure of hydration status. The last letter is T for thirst, and this is a simple one. If you're thirsty, it's a good indicator of the need to rehydrate. So these all go into a Venn diagram. If you have 2 of these markers showing that you're dehydrated, it's likely you are dehydrated. If you have 3 markers, warning light should be going off. It's very likely you're dehydrated. So once again, this is telling you about whether or not how you hydrated the previous day was good enough to, leave you hydrated in the morning. And so it's retrospectively telling you about whether or not you drank enough water. So if you did not drink enough water, you can rectify the situation prior to training. And the general recommendation is that you drink 2 to 4 milliliters per pound in the 2 to 4 hours before exercise. So obviously the 2 to 4 hours can be difficult if we're training first thing in the morning. And so getting as much water as comfortable in your belly is probably a good idea. You don't want to drink a ton of water right before you go running. But just to give you an idea, because sometimes those, volume measurements per pound can be confusing. For a 160-pound individual, it would be about 10 to 20 ounces of water that you would be looking to drink prior to exercising. So it's really important to try to begin exercise hydrated, because it definitely has an impact on performance. And like I mentioned before, especially with joint lubrication, it can also reduce the risk of injury. So just a little kind of something to add to maybe things that you pay attention in your training. Even if I know for some people, they don't like to weigh themselves daily, that's totally fine and understandable, but maybe pay attention to thirst, pay attention to urine color, and use those two to really evaluate how much you drank the next day and if it was enough. That amount is going to change with training volume. We'll talk about this in a minute with obviously environmental temperatures. And so it's something you need to measure on a regular basis. Okay, so in sport hydration. So hydration strategy should really be based on sweat rate, or the amount of water lost via sweat. And the average range of water lost during sweat is about 1/2 to 2 liters per hour. And pace and heat are the biggest factors on sweat rate. So that's what this graph is showing. On the x-axis, we have running speed, also translated into minutes per mile run. And on the y-axis, we have sweating rate. And as you can see, as we increase in speed, and then even more so as we go from cool and dry, that bottom line, to hot and humid environments, we see an increase in the amount of sweat loss with increasing speed, and also an increase in the amount of sweat loss with increasing environmental temperature and humidity. So this is the reason why we need to one really pay attention to whether or not our daily hydration is supporting our running hydration as environmental temperatures change and as your workouts change. But also it may lead to how you hydrate in workout, particularly if your workouts are longer. So let's talk a little bit about that. The best way to do that is a sweat rate test. Once again, more data. I hope you guys all like collecting data. This is something that you should do pretty regularly. And that's because, as we just talked about, sweat rate can change with varying seasons. It can change even in the course of a race. I've talked to a lot of people about looking at how much they need to hydrate during, let's say, the daytime of a 100-miler versus in the evening, when it's cooler and when you're wearing more clothes. The amount you hydrate should obviously change from one to the other. So thinking about that, thinking about how, as your fitness changes, your sweat rate might change, or if you're doing harder weeks, building up to a race, how your water requirements might change because your sweat rate goes up. So good thing to do regularly, and just kind of keep track so you know how your body responds to all of these different factors. It's really easy to do. I'm sure many of you have heard about this before, but I'll just run through it really quickly. You weigh yourself before running. You should be naked, because obviously clothes are going to impact the number on the scale. Make sure you put your clothes back on. Go for a run for a set amount of time. It is a good idea to mimic the racing distance if possible, but it also makes the calculation much more confusing. So I usually like to do it for an hour, and that's what I recommend. If you drank any water during that period, note how many ounces of fluid you drink. Then come back, weigh yourself after running, naked again, and you're going to subtract your post-run rate from your pre-run weight. And 1 pound of weight loss is equal to 16 ounces. So you're going to add the ounces you lost in sweat, the ounces that you consumed, to get the approximate amount of fluid ounces per hour that you should be drinking. So let's go through an example just so you get an idea. If your pre-run weight was 130 pounds, you ran for an hour and you consumed 8 ounces while running. And then when you got back, you weighed yourself again and it was 129 pounds. You lost 1 pound. So that's 16 ounces. And you add the 8 ounces that you drank for 24 ounces per hour. So you should aim for about 80% of this number. So that's about 19 ounces per hour. And then once again, you need to pay attention to losses of body mass. And that's particularly true for hot environments. So work on this number, measure it a lot, see how you feel. Take those notes in your training log. Like, yeah, I was, using 20 ounces per hour on my long run this weekend, and I felt great, or it was too much and I noted I was bloating, my ring was tight, I'm going to back it down a little bit. This gets to that, feedback and data that's going to make what you do on race day way more effective. Okay, so what about electrolytes? So sweat sodium concentration, well, let's talk about first what is in sweat. There are a number of different electrolytes in the world. The ones that are in sweat are magnesium, calcium, potassium, and sodium. What we lose to the greatest extent, and the electrolyte that you should really be focused on, is sodium. It's important to note that, right, we have a certain concentration of sodium in our blood. And the sweat sodium concentration, so the amount of sodium in the sweat we lose, is always going to be lower than the amount of sodium in our blood. And this is because we're losing water also as we sweat. So when we sweat, we're actually increasing the concentration of our blood sodium. That's kind of counterintuitive, but it's an important thing to remember. So the amount of sodium that you need during exercises depends on the amount of sodium you lose, but it also depends on the amount of fluid you replace. And this is kind of, I think, where people go wrong and where people get into danger with things like hyponatremia, is that often they're consuming way more fluid than they need to. And they might think that they're replacing the right amount of sodium, but because that fluid replacement is so large, they start diluting their body's level of sodium, and that's where we get into danger with hyponatremia. So currently, the recommendation is that for training less than 6 hours, the amount of sodium you replace is not as critical unless it's really hot. Because once again, as we talked about, with heat and humidity, we see a huge increase in sweat rate. So you should season fluids and foods to taste and to encourage drinking, absorption of water, as we mentioned, and eating. And a moderate amount of sodium is good for that. For training that's over 6 hours, sodium replacement should be planned. So some people have accessibility to sweat concentration tests, and that's a great thing to use if you are able to use it. You should not be replacing your sodium one-to-one, though. Basic recommendations are to replace about 30% of the sodium loss per hour. If you don't have accessibility to a sweat concentration test, start with about 250 milligrams to 300 milligrams of sodium per hour and adjust as needed. So there's, similar to the range of sweat rate, there's a huge range of the amount of sodium lost in sweat. I think it's somewhere from 200 to 1,000 milligrams of sodium per 16 ounces of sweat. So that number can vary greatly. And as a starting place, if you haven't already found that number that works for you, I'm recommending 250 milligrams to 300 milligrams, but your needs might be much higher. So once again, this is something you should play with and adjust. But the more fluid you replace, the more sodium you need. So once again, to remind you, we don't want to consume so much fluid, and that's why on the sweat test, I only recommended you replace 80% of your water loss. You don't want to consume so much fluid that you're diluting your body's concentration of sodium, because that's where we get into danger. Okay, so practice and collect data. I'm going to say that a lot, and I hope I've stressed this here. So take multiple sweat tests in varying conditions, mimic your goal pace, considered expected low and high temps. So think about if you're doing a long race and you're going to be running at night, think about how that may impact your fluid consumption in the evening. How much body weight are you losing? And is your fluid strategy serving you? Once again, if you're losing over 3% body weight, you're not efficiently replacing your water losses. Do you tend to over or underhydrate? Is thirst a good marker of hydration needs for you? So on shorter runs, you hear a lot, you can just use thirst. And I think that's great on runs that are under 2 hours, but often For longer runs, we need to set some kind of a reminder or make sure that we're consuming fluid regularly during the period, because it's not a hole that's easy to dig yourself out of if you are underhydrated. Do you need to actively replace sodium? So are you primarily running in hot temperatures? Do you live in hot and humid environments? Are all of your runs or races longer efforts? This is really when sodium replacement becomes critical. Are you planning on using liquid nutrition? This is another thing to think about. So Nick mentioned Gnarly Fuel 2.0, and it is a all-in-one nutrition product. So we have 100 calories per 12-ounce servings, per 12-ounce serving, that come from 2 different carbohydrate sources, so dextrose and sucrose. And we use those 2 different carbohydrate sources because it actually helps you get more carbohydrate into your body than if you were just to use one. Also has 250 milligrams per serving. So that's a great way to get electrolytes, to get sodium, and to get calories in your body all at once. But if for some reason you get flavor fatigue or your body just shuts down, if you're depending on that one water bottle for all those needs, you could get yourself in trouble. So I usually recommend people bring some liquid nutrition and also bring some plain water so that they can determine, what feels best at a given moment in time, because we all know in long races, you can definitely have ups and downs, both in terms of what you feel like eating or drinking and also how you're feeling and how your body responds. So I just kind of went through that. Let's jump into some carbohydrates and talk about timing and carbohydrate quality. So I hope all of us here realize that carbohydrates are a really important part of long distance running and of performance in running in general. And carbohydrate needs really should change with training, both in and out of the actual workout. So carbohydrates can help with performance goals, aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, and they're also really important fuel for our brain and our central nervous system. So this is a table of daily carbohydrate needs. So once again, this is daily needs, not specific to what you would consume in race. So we have light, moderate, high, and very high runs, all kind of divided out by the training level with each of those. So low intensity or skill-based activity, moderate training level is basically running for an hour a day. You're getting into higher levels when you're doing 1 to 3 hours a day consistently, and then very high levels when you're doing exercise lasting over 4 hours per day. I think it's also important to think if you don't have a desk job and your job requires a lot of manual labor, this should also be considered in your training level and also determine the amount of carbohydrates you take in. So we have anywhere from, at light levels, 3 to 5 grams of carbs per kilo per body weight per day, all the way up to 8 to 12 when we're doing exercise lasting over 4 hours. So you could imagine that over the course of a training week, as you go from light, easy recovery runs to maybe speed workouts or hill repeats to maybe your long runs on the weekend, especially if they're back-to-back long runs, your daily carbohydrate intake should change to match that. It doesn't mean that you have to go out and count, your grams of carbohydrate that you're consuming, but it might not be a bad idea to do some calculations and just see about where you are, and make sure you're getting close to that. Because if you are at the lower end when you're still training high, you're gonna definitely feel a difference when you start supplementing with carbohydrates a little more appropriately. So let's now talk about carbohydrate needs during training. So for runs under 45 minutes, you may not need anything if you are eating the appropriate amount of carbohydrates in your run. I will put an asterisk on this and say that, training first thing in the morning can be tricky because we've, basically fasted overnight and gone through not all of our glycogen stores, but a good amount of them. And so having a quick snack or something light to drink could be, your liquid nutrition, like Gnarly Fuel 2.0, could be a glass of orange juice, half a banana, graham crackers, things of that nature that are simple carbohydrates and easily absorbed, can be a good thing. And especially if your workout is one that is at higher intensity. So we're not talking like zone 1, zone 2, we're getting into zone 3, zone 4, then having some blood glucose on board is really going to help with performance. In longer runs of 45 to 75 minutes, still small amounts of carbohydrate could help with performance, but if your glycogen stores are well stocked, they might not be needed. As we get to runs that are an hour or 2.5 hours in length, then we need to start like looking at consistent carbohydrate intake. This also is very intensity dependent. As we're at zone 1 and zone 2 training, our body tends to use a lot of fat that we already have on board to fuel those runs. And so carbohydrate needs might not be as high, but in higher intensity zone 3 or zone 4 runs, then we do want to replace pretty consistently. So 30 to 60 grams of carb per hour, which is about 120 to 240 calories, if that unit makes much more sense for your brain. For 2.5 to 3 hour runs or longer, we're looking to get up to 90 grams per hour, which is about 360 calories of carbohydrate. It is really important to note that that is a lot of carbohydrate for most people, and not everybody needs that much. Once again, it really depends on your fitness and how long you've been doing long distance running. But if you are working up to this, it is going to take a lot of gut training and a lot of practice to get your gut used to taking in this high level of carbohydrate consistently. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about types of carbohydrates. I like this graph because it's pretty simple, and I think it makes easy distinctions between simple and more complex carbs. So on the x-axis, we have time in hours. On the y-axis, blood glucose levels. So the red line is clearly the food that is more fun: chips, biscuits, cake, ice cream, dates. Some of these obviously are not foods that you could have on a run. You know, ice cream would be probably inappropriate. But others like potatoes and watermelon, you know, you see it at aid stations all the time. The green line are, you know, our quote unquote healthier foods, complex carbohydrates, basmati rice, vegetables, lentils, pasta. So it's important to note that while often people will be like, oh, the red line's bad food, but both of these foods are really important for running performance and recovery. So high glycemic index foods, like the graph shows, elevate blood sugar quickly and should be timed around effort. So glycemic index is just a measure of how quickly something elevates our blood sugar, and then to what degree that elevation lasts. So high glycemic index foods can get our blood sugar up really fast. They can be great things like I just talked about, making sure you get a snack before a high intensity run first thing in the morning. So that would be a great place for a high glycemic index food. They're also great before and during to keep blood glucose levels elevated. So the more we can keep our blood glucose elevated, the more muscle glycogen and liver glycogen we spare. So that's a good thing during runs, especially during long runs. And then after, they're great for recovery because they help us quickly replenish spent glycogen. Of course, low glycemic index foods are also very important throughout the day. They're really high in micronutrients or vitamins and minerals, really high in fiber, which is really important for our gut health, and they contribute to glycogen storage over the course of a day. So let's talk a little bit about protein now. I'm going to talk a little bit about quality and timing. Protein people really see as kind of a recovery macronutrient, but I also want you to think about how important protein can be in terms of the adaptation to the running you do. So protein isn't just for strength athletes, and as endurance athletes, you should be strength training a little bit anyways. Endurance specific adaptations include the increased ability to use carbohydrates and fat for energy, because it's been shown that when protein's taken by endurance athletes, we see increasing mitochondrial density, and we also see an increase in mitochondrial enzymes. So remember, mitochondria are the little like energetic powerhouses that really help us process those macronutrients into ATP, so our muscles can do work. It's also a myth that just increasing protein will make you bulky. So it's actually pretty hard to put on muscle and really requires an overall increase in calories. So simply increasing the protein in your diet is not going to do that. So it's critical for recovery. It's critical for functional strength, which I would put both speed workouts and hill climbing in that category. It's important for strength training that can lead to injury prevention. And then, as I mentioned, endurance-specific training adaptations. So let's give a little background on protein so you understand how to pick good proteins and then how to include them in your diet. So proteins have a lot of different complex structures, but its most primary structure, protein, is like a bead of pearls, and each one of those pearls is an amino acid. So there are two main groups of amino acids, essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. An easy way to remember the difference is that it's essential that we get essential amino acids from our diet. And that's because we can't synthesize them. So all those non-essential amino acids we can actually make from other stuff, whereas the essential amino acids we have to consume via food. And of those essential amino acids, there's a little subset called the branch chain amino acids, so isoleucine, leucine, and valine. And they're important because they help turn on the metabolic pathway for muscle protein synthesis, which is important for building new muscle, but it's also important for recovery and repair of muscle. And leucine is really the most famous of those three. So what makes a high quality protein? Digestibility, so how much of the essential amino acids in a protein you actually see. Are we absorbing them, or are they just like passing through our digestive tract? Essential amino acid content. So we just talked about how we need to get essential amino acids from our diet. So you want to choose proteins that are high in essential amino acids. And then branch chain amino acids. So the proteins that have higher levels of leucine are really the proteins that are important for athletes to choose. And that's because leucine turns on muscle protein synthesis. So that's essentially what this table is showing. It's a combination of these three factors: protein quality, which is the amount of essential amino acids that we absorb. So that's a measure of digestibility. Essential amino acids, so the percent of total protein that are essential amino acids, and then leucine, the percentage of the protein that is the amino acid leucine. So we can look at these three and then determine, what protein sources are the best for us to consume as athletes. So as you can see at the top, dairy proteins are kind of the kings of the hill. They have a 100% digestibility rating. So we absorb all of the essential amino acids in them. They're really high in essential amino acids, and they have a lot of leucine. So really good. Meat is also generally a pretty good protein to consume. It is interestingly a little bit lower in digestibility than dairy, and also lower in essential amino acids and leucine. And there are some great plant sources if you're a plant-based athlete as well. Soy, although it's gotten a bad rap for a long time, it is one of the best plant protein sources you can choose. And don't believe the hype about phytoestrogens. It's not true. So if you are a plant-based athlete, I think you should fully, incorporate soy in your diet as much as possible. Another great one that's not on here is pea protein isolate, which is actually in Gnarly Vegan. It's also really high in essential amino acids and leucine. So you can get a good idea of what proteins you should include in your diet, but overall, just trying to make sure you get enough protein is a good thing. So what is enough protein? So the RDA for protein is really low. It's 0.8 grams per kilo per body mass. And this is a minimum for sedentary adults. But as athletes, we need to consume much more. So endurance athletes should consume at least between 1.4 and 1.6 grams of protein, per kilogram of body mass per day. If just real quick, if you take your body weight in pounds and divide it by 2.2, you'll have it in kilograms. So then you can multiply it by that range of 1.4, 1.6 to get an idea of where you are. That protein recommendation goes up the more you incorporate strength into what you do. And it's really important to note that all of these protein needs go up with age. And that's because as we age, the anabolic or muscle building impact that protein has decreases. So we need more protein to turn on those pathways for muscle protein synthesis, recovery, and repair. So as we get over 40, like most things, we just need to pay a little bit more attention. So I just made this quick table so you guys could see what that might look like at different weights. I won't go through all these numbers, but if you're 140 pounds, 1.5 grams per kilo per day is going to be about 96 grams of protein per day. Also divided that out into approximately what you should be getting per meal. And then that's all the way to the high range of 2 grams per kilo per day. And then all the way up to 200 pounds. So find about where you weigh and just get an idea of what that looks like. And then it's important to think about taking that protein and trying to divide it as evenly over the course of the day as possible. Trying to get in protein consistently and regularly really helps us with that consistent adaptation and repair because it keeps the amino acids in the protein circulating in our body. So 20 to 30 grams of protein contains the amount of leucine, which is about 1.75 to 2.25 grams, that are going to minimize any muscle protein breakdown and maximize muscle protein synthesis. That's going to lead to better adaptation and better recovery, which is a great thing for us as we're training for longer and longer races. So what does 20 to 30 grams of protein look like? I'm not a macro counter, even though I throw out a lot of numbers. I've gotten pretty good at knowing about how much protein is in things. And I think that's good enough, like trying to eat protein consistently in meals and snacks and having a rough idea of how much protein is in what you're eating is a good place to start. And if you want to get really granular about it, then you can start, tracking your grams of protein and carbohydrates. Not a bad thing, just can be a slippery slope for some people. So I put rough amounts to the right of different types of food and the volume amount that's going to be 20 to 30 grams of protein. And then there are good examples of plant-based, vegetarian, and pescatarian servings, which I think is often where people get caught up in whether or not they're getting in enough protein, but it's easy to get enough protein in any of these diets. Just trying to eat it consistently is the key. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about post-training nutrition and pull together some of what we talked about with hydration, carbs, and protein to see what meals post-training should look like. So our post-run nutrition should be anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours following. For a long time, they'd say it was the golden hour and you should get this in within an hour of training. And there is some research showing that we see better repletion of glycogen stores the sooner we start replenishing it post-workout, but you still will see really good recovery if you're getting it within 2 hours. So ideally, you want to get in 16 to 18 ounces of fluid and electrolytes. Your carbohydrate intake should be about 1.2 grams per kilo per hour. And this should be for the 4 to 6 hours post-training. This is if your run is glycogen depleting. So this is really when we're talking about longer runs, where you're likely going through all the carbohydrate stores in your liver and your muscle. And even if you're doing the best you can and you are able to take into 90 grams of carb per hour pretty consistently, you're still going to have glycogen depletion because we're just physiologically not able to take in as much carbohydrate as our body is using to fuel our runs. So it's going to happen, and you do have to be pretty good about trying to replenish that post-run. As far as carbohydrate to protein, a 1-to-4 ratio is a great idea. So that's 1 part protein to 4 parts carbohydrate. So that could look like 20 to 30 grams of protein, because remember that's the magic range to get enough leucine to really adapt muscularly and recover well from what we did. And that would mean 80 to 100 grams of carbohydrate. Plan ahead with possible. Supplements are great for that. Really, that's why they're called supplements, because they're supplemental. If you can meet your needs with whole foods, I definitely recommend that. But often, we're out running somewhere and it's nice to just have a banana and a protein shake in the car and not wait till we get home. So some food ideas based on those numbers. Once again, the meal focus should be carbohydrate, protein, and hydration. Protein shake with fruit is great. Granola with yogurt and fruit. Greek yogurt is particularly good for this, or even cottage cheese. Both are really high in protein. Eggs and potatoes are a favorite of mine. Rice with veggies and protein, that could be meat or tofu, or even something as simple as a turkey sandwich. All right, I know that was a lot of information. I see that the numbers in the chat are up to 16. I think I went under time, so I feel like we have plenty of time for questions, and I'm happy to take some. Do you, Nick and AJ, do you guys want me to go through the questions, or do you want to read them to me? What's the best way to handle them?
Nick's muted.
I think, yeah, you're muted.
Sorry, AJ, do you want to pull out some questions there from the chat? Have you been monitoring it?
Yeah, there's Nick Nudell was asking about research citations and asking if they could be provided.
Yeah.
No real questions. Joe was talking about his high sweat rate. I was talking about my low sweat rate. So Brad is asking any recommendations for how to train your gut to take in more calories per hour besides simply trying it over and over.
I mean, that's
sandwiches saved as a race. Yeah.
I love that. Well, first on Joe, I am a high rate sweater like you. So I understand that. As far as training your gut, there's the really only way to do it is to start where you are, obviously, and then slowly work your way up week after week. I would recommend, let's say you're starting at about 30 to 40 grams. So once again, that's 120 to 160 calories per hour. That's a pretty low rate. If you, on your next run, could inch that up to over 200 calories per hour or 50 grams of carbohydrate, see how you feel, be consistent with that, and then get closer and closer to that 90 gram range. Make sure that you're not just focusing on the gram amount, but also being consistent with how you get in those grams of calories. So are you using liquid nutrition mainly? Are you supplementing with some solids? Do you know which solids are going to work for you? Are you a person who likes to stop at the aid station tables and try a range of the snacks they have there? Are you incorporating those into your training runs? I think these are things to kind of think through, like what you're going to do on race day and how you can best try to copy that in your training runs. So making sure that if you're going to introduce variety on race day, that you have somewhat of a variety as you're doing your longer runs when you train. That would be my recommendation. But really the only way to train your gut is to slowly work it up and then be consistent about trying to get in that caloric intake on all your longer runs.
So in terms of practicing in training our calorie intake, how many, if we're doing, let's say, a long run every weekend, and then maybe we have a midweek kind of mid-long run, and then the rest is kind of in that 45 minutes to 75-minute range. How many of these runs should we be practicing with kind of calorie intake?
I think your long runs are really where you should be practicing, because that's where it matters the most. Even on your mid to long runs, unless you know that you maybe haven't fueled with carbohydrates or consumed enough carbohydrates over the day, you're starting with full glycogen stores, and your need, because it's a shorter distance, may be lower. So really focusing on the training during your longer runs is the way to go. I was recently talking to a dietitian the other day, and she actually, as opposed to necessarily planning out all of her snacks for her long runs, she just saves all of her wrappers and then counts them up, afterwards to figure out what her caloric intake was and how it worked. And that could be a good way to do it too, if you're not someone that wants to be like quite so particular about it. But I do think having an idea of where your sweet spot is in terms of how you feel with replenishing calories and carbohydrates on a regular basis is important to know going into a race. And so paying attention to that maybe a little bit more on those races that mimic that distance, or runs that mimic that distance, is important.
Okay. And I'll just add, so for reference, the Gnarly product, the Fuel 2.0 that we're going to be stocking at our aid stations, it's 100 calories per 12-ounce serving. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, so that's 25 grams of carbs. So at that concentration, if you were going to rely purely on what is in the coolers during your races, you would likely, that's 25 grams, so you would likely need to supplement with solids. Often people will concentrate it more in their water bottles if they're carrying it themselves. And so you could carry 200 to 300 calories, you know, in an 18 to 20 ounce water bottle. And then I would once again recommend carrying some plain water as well. Anytime we take in concentrated carbohydrates, it's always a good idea to wash them down with some water, because anytime we take a concentrated solution into our gut, it can affect how water flows in and out and lead to some gut distress. So that's where the idea of carrying some liquid nutrition and also some plain water is always a good idea.
Just on top of that note, my in college nutrition, we were talking about some biochemistry components, but I think if you play catch, I would definitely discourage people from trying to play catch up with their carbs too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you overload the carbs in the gut at one time, you can draw in water to the gut if those carbs are there too long, because there's too much, and then that water has to go one of the two directions.
That's the constant. That's what same reasoning with the concentrated carbs. So it's not just catching up. If you have like a goo packet, you know, or 2 goo packets at once, so water moves from an area of low concentration of solutes to an area of high concentration of solutes. So in your gut, when you have too much carbohydrate, or it also is true for electrolytes, when you have way too many electrolytes and it's more concentrated than what is in your body, then water is going to travel from your body into your gut, leads to GI distress. It also dehydrates you. So it's, you know, a double doozy. So one, watch out for concentrated carbs. And as AJ said, don't try to catch up on those things. It should be like a slow drip.
Yeah. And then as a fun fact, I think it's 1 gram of carbohydrate is stored in the body with 3 grams of water or something like that. So just another important factor in staying hydrated with that. But okay, next question was, I lost track here. I don't know if, that was I don't know if that was Catherine's question. Oh, wait, here we go. We're back to, so that was Brad's question. Then we have Joe asking, what are your strategies for getting the right ratio of water electrolytes to fuel when using liquid calories, since the ratio is set by the drink mix, but your needs may vary with weather, duration, etc.? Yeah,
so specific to Gnarly Fuel 2.0, it's 250 milligrams of sodium per 12 ounces. We do have a higher salt version that's 500 milligrams of sodium per 12 ounces. But if neither of those concentrations work for you, or as mentioned, you're running in higher heat or humidity and need to increase your salt intake, that's where taking salt tabs, or sometimes they have like those elite drops where you can add, concentrated electrolytes to your water and it doesn't affect the taste too much. Those could be options. There's also a lot of sodium in sports nutrition solid products, like Goos have sodium in them. Cliff Shots have sodium in them. They even have some higher sodium versions of that. There's saltier foods that you could just take in from Whole Foods. So also realize that some of that salt is also coming from your solids and should be factored into the equation as well.
Okay. Chris asks, how does altitude impact nutrition absorption and or caloric needs?
Yeah, so altitude, one, I want to say this first. I'm sure you are aware that it definitely impacts hydration needs dramatically, because we're often at a higher heart rate. We're working harder at higher altitude. We're also then our sweat rate increases. We're perspiring more. We're also losing more water in our breath. So definitely if you're running at higher altitude, that's something to consider. and also maybe a factor to bring into your sweat rate test. But because of that higher heart rate, it is also going to take us into a higher zone as we increase our energy expenditure. So we increase from something like a zone 2 run, which you might be at a longer race that's flat, to a zone 3 run or a zone 4 run, which you might experience during a high altitude race simply because of the elevation. You're going to step more decisively into burning purely carbohydrates. And that's going to increase your need to be more diligent about taking in those carbohydrates. So once again, when we're at lower zones, our body uses more stored fat as fuel. So I'm not talking about taking in fat as a fuel, but the fat, even the leanest person has enough fat storage to fuel them for really long periods of time. And we really use those fat stores at lower intensities. It's as we slowly increase intensity that we see carbohydrates becoming more important. So anything that you do that increases your intensity is going to increase your need to take in carbohydrates. So I hope that helps. You're on mute, AJ.
Newbie error there. How much electrolyte mix would you put into daily water to drink throughout the day to help with absorption?
Yeah, I mean, I drink our hydrate just because I really love the taste of it. It's our kind of lower calorie, has a little bit of sugar in it, once again, because we need that for active transport of water into our body, but it has 250 milligrams per 16 ounces when you mix it up. But I've heard like a tablespoon of maple syrup and a teaspoon of salt is like all you need. You don't really need a ton in there, but a little bit of sodium, or if you're just consuming water with meals, that's good as well. And typically that water with meals is not like if it contains a minimum of X amount of sodium. So I think the macronutrients in the food that you're eating as a whole help with that absorption.
The next question is about caffeine and recommendations about caffeine intake, or is it more personal preference?
Yeah, I think it's a personal preference. There's definitely a good amount of research showing that caffeine can help reduce perceived exertion. So essentially make you feel like you're not working as hard as you actually are. The most of the research around athletic performance is that I've seen is relative to that. So I do know that there's a huge range in how sensitive people are to caffeine. So where you fall in that range is really going to determine how you feel. There's also a huge line between like when caffeine can be beneficial and when it can be jittery and cause issues. Personally, I like to have it just to clear my bowels first thing before I go on a run. And, you know, I consume it lightly during my longer runs when I feel like I need it. But I think it's mostly personal preference.
I just have something to add too. So first off is I think that it's also been shown to like increase fat utilization a little bit. I don't think that matters the whole time. But then just in terms of like the dosage, I know there was a systematic review for endurance athletes a couple of years ago, but I think it was like 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram body weight taken 30 to 90 minutes prior to exercise was like the pre-exercise dosage. And then during exercise was just considering like topping up every 1 to 2 hours as needed. It was kind of like the recommendation.
Awesome.
I forgot.
Yeah, I've seen the fat utilization, but I will say that there's not a lot of literature. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it matters as much as people think, but the reduced perceived exertion was huge though in some of those studies. I love my caffeine. Anyway, and then the next question is, I'm doing my second 100-mile race in September. In my first 100-mile race in 2023, I had some pretty tough GI issues, multiple trips to the brush. What advice can you give from a hydration nutrition standpoint to try and minimize chances of that happening again? Probably what we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to dive in a little bit and know how you were fueling, both in terms of the amount of carbs, if you were taking them all at once. So I definitely am a fan of like setting a timer every 20 minutes and dividing, you know, your dose over that 20 minutes, as opposed to like trying to take all, let's say 70 grams of carbohydrates in one sitting. Also would matter like the type of carbohydrates. Were you going for liquid nutrition or solid nutrition? I'd say most gut distress can, as AJ pointed out, can be related to maybe consuming too many simple carbs all at once, and then not consuming enough water maybe to dilute them in your system if that is your preferred fuel source. And so maybe trying to, one, divvy out those carbs, two, make sure that the amount you're consuming is appropriate. You could have just also been consuming too much. And then three, playing around with those different types of sources. So maybe introducing some more complex foods would help calm down your gut and not lead to so many issues. I've been there too. The first time I ever did a half Ironman, I thought it would be a really good idea to fuel completely on goose. And I swear I spent 2 hours in the porta potty afterwards, clearing my system out.
And then, yeah, this is Brad's question. Any recommendations for how to rehab a gut once it goes sour mid-race? And then real quick, Brad, I know you're reading my message right now. Can I transfer host to you and then you finish this up? I got to go put the kiddos to bed.
Better to do it to Nick. I have a
To Nick? Okay, cool.
direction as well.
Nick, does that work?
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, really
Okay.
appreciate it.
Bye.
Yeah, sour gut during